Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for spending your Friday with us. Happy Friday to you all. My name is Mark Holder. I'm the account manager here at TouchPoint Solution. Uh, Please welcome me in joining our webinar host, Dr. Caroline Danda. Dr. Danda,
Hello.
she is
Hello.
a
Hello.
clinician child psychologist, and she has a passion for empowering both families and individuals. She specializes in anxiety, depression, ADHD, and what we call big emotions. Her evidence based strategies are tailored to fit each person's life. She's a mother of three herself, and so she intimately understands the challenges that many families face, and she collaborates with many schools in order to drive positive impact. So, Dr. Danda, I'll let you take it from here.
All right. Well, I am super excited to be here. This really is a passion of mine to share information all about ADHD and kids and parenting and really kind of get everybody on the same page, both from my experience as a clinician and as the mother of three boys that also have had ADHD, which of course, all kids are different and their presentations of ADHD are also all different. So I feel like those do combine to help understand just how a lot of different things come together. So, but we'll get started, and I am going to just get started and talk about kind of how I view ADHD and then why we might do some of these strategies, because that will help us figure out what we need to do next. So there I am. So we can move on to the next slide. So the first thing to really think about is the link between ADHD and big emotions. So if I, and you guys are welcome to use the little chat, the reaction box or whatever, but if I ask people to raise their hand and say, how many of their kids with ADHD seem to have big, intense emotions? My guess is that a lot of you would be raising your hand, or if there's a little chat thing or little reaction thing, that we're going to get a lot of reactions. And really what I see is that one of the links, we do find that kids with ADHD do have 3 times more linked to emotional dysregulation than kids without ADHD, and that they tend to react more strongly to negative events. But not necessarily to consequences. So the consequences don't always seem to impact their behavior the way that we would like them to. So, and one of the reasons for that is that I see ADHD truly as a regulation issue. It's a problem with regulating their emotions. We can go to the next slide. Their energy, their behavior, and their attention. So it's not that they don't have them. It's a challenge of them being able to regulate them. And Ned Hallowell put this really beautifully. He coined this term. He said, you have a race car brain, but bicycle brakes. So a lot of times, if you really want to think about your kid and their brains, they have this race car and they are just blazing ahead on their own path. And they have a ton of great ideas. So a lot of your kids are probably also very creative. They have lots of ideas. They can think outside the box. They're ready to do things, and they're also super excited. We love those parts of the emotional pieces that are positive, but we may not always like the ones that are more negative in terms of anger or frustration or things like that. Sometimes are harder to kind of deal with. But we're really looking at nervous system regulation. And what we need to do is help train the brain and help build up those brakes so that they can slow down. And so that's really the framework that we want to kind of look at is if kids can do well, they will. So if they can, they will. And so a lot of kids don't always have the capacity to do that. So let's talk a little bit about what routines and strategies can help maybe kind of help those big emotions from erupting. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about what to do when you actually get those big emotions. So next slide. Really, let's talk about it. If they've got a race car brain, we need to help them slow down, or we also have to build in kind of that time. So if you think about those car analogies, so they're like a lot of times trying to write on people's bumpers. So as a parent, what we need to do is kind of build in extra transition time and expect that they're going to need more time to transition from activity to activity. So again, how many of your kids maybe have trouble like going from activity to activity, from, you know, maybe finishing up what they're doing to going to lunch or going to dinner or going out the door, even though they're things they might like to do in general, but they may have trouble actually transitioning from one activity to the next. Yes, we've seen that all. So what we're going to do is really think about a couple of things that we want to do to help with those transition times and also help with following directions. Because again, if you think about it, so these race car brains, they do not want to drive on slow roads. So, and they're also kind of moving forward and they're on their own path. And so a lot of times you might come and say, hey, but I need you to do this. And they're like, what? You didn't tell me that, or I can't do that. Like that's their immediate reaction. And part of that's like, if you imagine a race car going really super fast and you say, hey, I need you to turn left, they're going to be like, yikes, I can't do that. Well, you did, right? That's exactly what's happening, is they're on their path and they can't slow down. And so these are, so you have to assume that they're never really going to be turning on a dime. And that's why also the hurry up method also doesn't work, because they're already moving really fast and you're telling them to hurry up and they're not able to kind of process that information. And so a couple of things that can help with that is what I call listen with your eyes. And that might sound a little bit weird, but in reality, what listening, so all the words and the sounds get put together into our brains through our ears. So our ears are processing the sounds to make them into words. But if I'm looking at you, all of a sudden your brain says, oh, maybe I should pay attention and maybe I should figure out like what actually it is that you're saying. Maybe I should process that information. And so what we don't want to do, though, is we don't want to say, give me your eyes, give me your eyes, give me your eyes, because that's really annoying. So the best thing that you can do is say, give their name, right? Susie, use touch. And then what you can do is wait and give a pause. And if you do that, pretty much 9 times out of 10, they're going to eventually look up. And as soon as they look up, that's when you say, hey, thanks for your eyes. I have something you need to do, or we're going to talk about like whatever it is the next thing is. But it's really about doing the name, touch, pause, and then wait for the eyes. And then here's the deal. If you're expecting your kid to give you their eyes, guess what? You got to give them your eyes too whenever they're ready, right? So if they're asking for your attention, you also need to give them your eyes. And it might even be like you're looking at them and saying, I hear you. You have something important to say. I'll be right with you. So even doing that can also maybe stave off a little bit of that demanding, like, I need this, I need this, I need this. The other thing that's part of that transition is avoid the immediate no. So they've got their idea, they're on their plan, they're doing their thing. And so as soon as you say no, a lot of times that's a trigger word for, yikes, I can't do my plan. And so one of the things you can do is first reframe the request. I want to have candy. Oh yes, candy is super yummy. I know you really like to have candy, and we do have some. I think this is the best time to have it, because a lot of the requests are not bad requests. A lot of it's about timing. So if you can avoid the immediate no, you might avoid a little bit of that, just this distress as soon as they like, I can't get what I want. Because a lot of times you can get what you want, just not when you want. The other thing you can do is preview changes. So sometimes I will say literally, hey, you know what? We've got a change coming up. And I know you might not like it, but hear me out. And I'm going to tell you what it is. And then we'll figure out what to do. So instead of saying, you know, hey, we're not going to be able to do this today, blah, 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 you can kind of actually have a lead in. So that's like what I talked about before with the car transition. So instead of bumper to bumper, you've kind of backed them up so they have 2 car lengths a little bit. So you've got their attention, and then you're giving them the instruction about what's coming up. And so then they might be able to hear you a little bit more. So basically you have to be ready, build in transition time. So don't expect that you can get ready and get everybody else ready while your child also needs to get ready. So you really need to build in some of that transition time. My other favorite thing to use is called the stopping point. So most of the time, what we do is we ask our kids using time. You've got 5 more minutes, you've got 10 more minutes, you've got whatever minutes. How often does that really work? Not probably as often as we'd like, because what happens is they're kind of maybe hearing you. They may not be fully processing it, but what's happening is they're like, well, I have like 5 more minutes to play. And so when it's actually time to be done, they're not ready. And so what I would say is if you need to leave in 10 minutes, then what you might do is 10 minutes ahead of time, or even 15, and say, hey, it's time to wrap up and find your stopping point. And then you say, well, what is your stopping point? How much longer is this video game? What's the next step? So you want to be concrete in your stopping point, not time-based, because most kids with ADHD also are kind of time blind and they don't monitor time, especially if they're doing something fun. And so you can offer equally valid choices. Like, would you like to do 3 more steps in Legos, or do you want to get 5 more steps, or do you want to do the next page, or whatever? So you can kind of give a concrete kind of choice that they can do. And again, avoid the immediate no when they say, I want to watch the whole video. You can say, well, how long is that video? Oh yeah, 30 minutes. I really wish we had 30 minutes, but unfortunately we don't have that much time. So I'm thinking maybe we could stop after, 5 minutes, or we can stop after 10 minutes, or we can kind of give some choices there, but also maybe let them know when they can get back to it, right? Because some kids don't want to stop things because they don't know if they're going to get a chance to do it again or when. The other thing that you're not going to want to hear, but I'm going to tell you anyway, is you've done this great thing. You've established a stopping point. Now you actually have to supervise the stopping point. So it would be really nice if your kids would just say, oh, well, I'm going to stop here. And then they just do it, right? Well, here's the deal. Most of the time that they have trouble with transitions is they're having trouble with transitions because they're moving from a preferred fun activity to something that's non-preferred, like going to bed and getting ready for bed and brushing your teeth, or even eating is less preferred than doing something that's fun, or even going out the door. They might have fun going to soccer, but they don't like the going out the door part. And so if you're expecting them to just do it all on their own, that's an unreasonable expectation, because it's essentially saying, I need you to stop eating Oreos so you can eat Brussels sprouts. Who's going to do that? The other thing is on the similar vein is, it's if they're doing something that they really enjoy, it's like having a bowl of potato chips in front of you and you say, you know what, I'm really just going to eat 2. How many of us can really do that? Right. So that's really not fair to expect them, like, I can actually regulate myself and inhibit my temptation if what we want is right in front of us. Of course, we're going to watch a little bit more. Of course, we're going to want to do a little bit more. So that's just the nature of all of us. So you also want to reinforce the stopping point when they do, and maybe supervise it. And you can be commenting about, like, maybe they're playing Legos or doing something, and you'd be like, all right, cool. You've got that piece there. You're doing this piece. You're doing a great job putting this together. And then as they get to that stopping point, you're like, great, you made it to your stopping point, right? So that way you're also widening their field of vision, so they're not straight out there and on their road. They're seeing that there's other things out there, that there might be a left, right? The last thing I would say would be sometimes save that direction for after they've actually stopped, right? So again, that's the whole stop eating Oreos so you can eat Brussels sprouts. You don't want to say, hey, I need you to stop playing your video game so you can get a bath. Like, that just there's not a lot of incentive there. Sorry. So that's kind of one of my things that I think works especially well for kids with ADHD, but actually it works pretty well for most kids. So you can try this on some of your other kids if you've got other kids. All right. So kind of moving on, we want to know how many of you get frustrated whenever you try to give a consequence and it seems like they keep doing it over and over again, even if there's a consequence, or it doesn't seem like they care about the consequences, or you try to, you get the kid and you're like, I wanted the blue cup, right? And they're like, oh, okay, fine, I'll give you the blue cup. And they're like, no, it's still not right. And you're like, you're trying to be logical. You're trying to give consequences. You're trying to help them, and it's just not working. Well, let's talk about why that is. It all starts with our brains, right? So we can imagine our brain and we can divide it into 2. So we can kind of have the upstairs brain, which is sometimes I'll refer to a wizard brain or a thinking brain, and the downstairs or lizard feeling brain, right? And the thinking brain is all the things like organization, problem solving, attention, impulse control, decision making, like all these things that make us human, and it's developing till you're 25, right? So your kids don't have a fully developed frontal lobe, right? Executive functioning, right? And so the downstairs part is automatic, right? And that's really where our feelings come up. right? So that's the other important thing to know is when your kids are feeling whatever they're feeling, they're not doing it on purpose. They just show up. Our feelings just show up. We can sometimes prime things to help us have different feelings, make them more likely to occur. But in the end, feelings are an automatic process, right? And here's the deal is when you have your brain here and you get this giant emotion, and that's where your amygdala comes in. Your amygdala is kind of your on-off switch for those big emotions. And your hippocampus is your memory center, right? Sometimes those two, your amygdala, I call it, sometimes it's like what creates the yikes feeling, right? And your hippocampus and your amygdala sometimes get together and it's not a good thing because your hippocampus will go, remember when? That was terrible. You don't want to do that. That was uncomfortable. That was no fun. And so then it triggers your amygdala to go, yikes, right? And then when we get that big feeling, essentially what happens is our thinking brain turns off. And that's great if we have a yikes moment and we're stepping out into the street and we're about to get hit by a car. Yeah, we don't want to have thinking brain in charge. There's a car, it's going fast. Maybe it'll hit me, right? That's not going to work very well. And so what happens is when your kids get these big emotions, they go into this lizard brain. And so they're in fight, flight, or freeze, right? And so I want you to stop for a minute and think about when your kids are melting down and having big emotions, how often can that be seen through a lens of fight, flight, or freeze? So fighting means they're throwing a fit and they're trying to get out of doing whatever they're doing, or they're flailing, or they're doing other things. Flight means they're avoiding, right? They're trying to get out of something. So fight and flight sometimes actually work together like that, or they're just refusing to go. Or they'll say things like, I don't care. I don't want to do it, right? I just don't like it, right? That's another way of like saying I don't like it or whatever, or I don't want to do it. And then freezes, they just shut down, right? So I want you to stop and really think about how often when your kids are melting down and having big emotions, how often is it they're in the fight, flight, or freeze? I'm going to say probably pretty often. And so really what our first goal is we have to help them get from that downstairs brain up to the upstairs brain. We have to interrupt the emotion, right? And allow the brain to reset. The brain and body kind of go back. I don't know. Whoa, we went too far. There we go. Because all their feelings are valid, right? It's the behaviors, like we have to support helping them regulate their nervous system because they can't do it. If they could, they don't like feeling that way. That's the big deal is they don't like having all those big emotions, right? And if they could calm them down themselves, they probably would, right? So we have to connect before direct and connect or correct. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. So I do this thing called emotion coaching. And usually this takes me like a whole session to kind of go through. So we're going to go through this pretty quickly. But the first thing we have to do is name it. You name the situation, you name the feeling. So you're frustrated because your sister took your toy. You're mad because you can't go, or disappointed because you can't go play with your friend. You really love candy and you're disappointed you can't have it. So it's just a statement, right? No questions. That's a very important thing. Because if you're asking, why are you upset, right? So that does two things. A, why is not a fair question when your thinking brain's not working, because it's almost like this nice open-ended essay question when they can't think straight, right? A lot of times they also can't really put a name to their feelings themselves, right? And then sometimes if you use why are you upset? It almost feels like you're blaming them or it's wrong for them to feel upset. And so we don't want to, with all their feelings are okay. And so but if you just name it, then that gives them a springboard. That gives them a jumping off point. And then they might say something. And if they do, then you reflect it back. So you're like, yes, I wanted that blue cup because I'd been waiting all day for it. And so you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yes, you were really looking forward to having the blue cup. So it is really hard when you don't get what you want, right? So you're not necessarily agreeing with what's happening, but you could validate their feelings, right? And all of a sudden it's like, you're telling them I get it, but you can't say I get it because that's dismissive, right? And then you can see it from their you can see the problem from their perspective and then try to figure it out. Like it's really hard whenever something doesn't go your way, or if you were in charge, this is probably not how you would do it. And so validating it and trying to see it from their perspective gives us a little more compassion for them and a better way of handling it. And then we have to allow time for the pause. So once they're actually having, once you've kind of connected with the emotion, Then you want to allow time and create space so that they can pause. You can't tell them what to do. You want to avoid the shoulds and you need to. You can't say you need to go to your room. You can't say that you need to do your breathing now, things like that. So a lot of ideas are like, hey, I might, you know what, you're still pretty frustrated. I'm frustrated. I'm going to take a minute so we can figure this out. Right. So it's creating a pause, but it's also with the idea that you can figure it out together. So all of a sudden you've gone from being the director to being a collaborator with them, and they feel like you're on your side, and you avoid some of that power struggle. Right. Or if you're going to say, oh my gosh, that was unexpected, I need a minute so I can think it through and then we'll figure it out. It's that we'll figure it out that's super important. Right. And again, we can do a lot of things ahead of time to try to kind of stage it so that they know what to do and when to do it. But a lot of time, if you're doing the thing you want them to do and modeling it, it kind of helps create the space too. And it makes them not feel bad for having the emotion. And honestly, you probably need the break too, right? So that does go, I'm gonna segue right over to our little, nope, not yet. I'm gonna segue over into our, the orange circle, the orange chat thing, because delivery matters, right? Because if you're saying, you know what, we're just going to calm down and it'll be okay, we'll get it, we'll figure it out, right? That is not going to get the message across that you really want. So what I like to think about is whenever your kids are upset, your job is to step back and so that you can respond. Right? It doesn't feel like it because it feels like we want to get in, we want to fix it, we want to solve it, we want to consequent it, we want to do, but nope, I'm going to ask you as a parent to say, I got to put my oxygen mask on first, right? And why did the flight attendants tell you to put yours on first? I mean, yes, it's so you can help other people, but the reason they have to do it every single time is because it's not instinct, and neither is slowing down for yourself. But if you're in lizard brain, and your kid's in lizard brain, nothing good happens and it just gets worse from there. So you can take a minute, right? You can do some breathing, you can count, do whatever you need to do. And what I like to think about is using a matter of fact and what I call the low and slow tone. So if you start slowing down how fast you're speaking, you go at that lower register of your voice, because I know sometimes my voice can get pretty loud when I'm excited or otherwise, and it can look like I'm feeling mad or upset when actually I'm not as upset. So I have to work really hard on, I need to be low and slow. And when you do that, it communicates calm to your child, but it also helps you feel calmer. And I hope you actually heard that as I was practicing that. You may have heard that in my voice and felt that. And then the other thing, since they're in the lizard brain, the animal brain, we're going to be at or below eye level because that's universally non-threatening, and use touch if they'll tolerate, your kid best, and their name. And those things, like sometimes just touching their arm, rubbing their back, touching their hand. So sometimes I'll be like, you know what? That was pretty rough. You look like you need a hug. Let's take a hug and then we'll figure it out. That may be something. And once they're calm, then we can go to brainstorming and problem solving. And that helps with their flexibility. So you can say like, oh, so this was the problem, is that you wanted candy and you couldn't have it when you wanted it. And I know these are very simple. It could also be like you were having trouble with your homework and you didn't understand the problem. Okay, well, let's figure out what our options are from here. And here you could ask questions because they should be calmer. And then you can also then figure out how to like say, well, here's kind of what I was thinking. So and then you can figure out from there, evaluate those solutions and say like, how would that work for you? Right. So if you can get them on board with figuring out what works for them, they're going to be more likely to follow it. This is another case where you don't use avoid and should. Here's what you need to do. Here's what you should have done. Ideally, you're bringing them into the fold and you're trying to help them come to that solution. And then all the way at the bottom, that's where you set limits and consequences. So not up at the top, which is what we want to do. We think, well, you can't do that. You can't talk to your mom like that. You can't do these things. But honestly, if you start to do that when they're in high emotion, you're really just going to get distracted from the problem that was there. And that's not very helpful. And so it's not that we agree with it, but if you ignore it and you stay focused on, oh, I can tell you're still really upset, instead of going, you can't say that, or, things like that. But down at the bottom, it's the whole message is it's okay to feel what you feel. It's not okay to use mean words or actions to yourself or other people. So sometimes the natural logical consequence is they apologize and they say or do something nice for the person they offended, including themselves. Like sometimes I'll have a jar of affirmations, and if they're mean to themselves and say something negative themselves, sometimes I'll have them pull out an affirmation for themselves, that type of thing. So I'm actually a lot less concerned about number 6, because almost if they can get through the first steps and calm down and reset, then maybe that's all the consequence they need, because they're learning, and that's what our goal is. All right. So bottom line is, also as a parent, if you have a child that has ADHD or other neurodiversity, or even if they don't, we're all doing the best we can for where we're at and what we know. We can only continue to learn and adapt as we get more information. And it's important that you model accepting mistakes too. I like to use oops. I got that from Eileen Kennedy Moore. She said, instead of saying I'm sorry all the time, you go, oops, that didn't work out. And that kind of makes it less judgmental. So I really like that approach. And then just expect that sometimes your kids are going to melt down, but that you just deal with it in the moment instead of dreading it all the time, because that expands how much you have anxiety and everything else. All right. I think that is my big rundown of just how to kind of help manage emotions and transitions with your kids. I appreciate you guys listening in and participating, and would love to, I think we have a couple minutes maybe for questions. I don't know. I'll let Mark.
Well, I want to call note on this last slide for staying tuned for part 2 of this series, Growing Your Calm to Support Your Child. That'll be held on August 18th. So I didn't want to advance to the Q&A without calling out that next webinar in the series.
That's great. And I do have you're going to get a follow-up email as well, and that'll have a survey in there for you to fill out, so you can add, kind of comment on some of the things that were going on, as well as you'll have a chance to win one of my recommended books. And there'll be some resources there too.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat if it's easier for you, or you can raise your hand.
We do have a question asking if there's going to be access to the recording.
Yes, so we will be posting the recording to YouTube. We'll also be including that link in the email that we're sending after this webinar. So if anyone wanted to join that couldn't participate today, you'd be welcome to share that link, and it will be on YouTube.
Great.
Andrea Winter has a question of how would you support a child that is school refusing?
That's probably more time than I have right now, but that is a future webinar. I think, a lot of times is kind of slowing it down and kind of figuring out what is it about school that's a hard thing. So I think in terms of going back to validating emotions and trying to figure those things out, I think that's probably one of the most important things, is trying to figure out, well, what is it that's kind of the challenge? Because if we don't know what's keeping them from going, it's harder to address it. So that would probably be my first thing. And then once you know what's going on, then it's really thinking about how do you kind of break down the steps a little bit? How do you make it more bite-sized or manageable for your kids, so that they can find a little bit of their brave, if you will, and get curious about what could happen. But they want as much as we could do with familiar things, the better. I kind of sometimes will say, like, I have kids do this thing where they decide, like, well, let's think about school too, with all the change, like what's the same? What do you actually know that's the same, and what's going to be different? And a lot of times that can be really super helpful in terms of thinking about what it is that, like, wow, there's more that I know already. It's not quite as scary because there's more that I know. There's more that it's familiar. And I did actually I just posted a blog post about some Black to School tips on my website, carolinedanda.com. And so that may address some of those things too. But that's tough when they're refusing school. And I would highly recommend that you reach out to the school. And so it's got to be a collaborative effort to work with the school, because a lot of times if they have one person at school, just one person that they feel that they can identify with, that they connect with, that can be their support person, so they need to have a trusted adult, and ideally even if they have a friend that they can walk in the building with, or sometimes like that. Sometimes it works to change the drop-off person too as well. Sometimes that makes it easier. So there's just a couple of tips, but I'm sure it's a little bit more involved in that, but hopefully that kind of gets you started.
Any more questions? That was great, Dr. Danda.
Thank you.
So looks like we might not have any more questions here.
Great.
Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Dr. Oh, looks like I think we got one new question. Dr. Danda, what about refusing food?
I think part of it is so there's a lot wrapped up in that.
Yeah.
If they're refusing food, like one of the things I also like to think, anytime they're refusing things too, I also have to look at that bigger picture. If they're refusing a lot of things, then chances are the thing that they're refusing the most is going to be hard to work on directly if they're just have a lot of refusal in a lot of other areas. So sometimes we have to kind of right that ship a little bit. When they're refusing food, sometimes is good to take a break from, it depends on like refusing to try new foods, refusing food at all. If they're refusing food at all, you definitely need to talk to your pediatrician and get some professional support if they're refusing food at all. But if they're refusing to try new foods and things like that, I think sometimes what you can do is take a back seat for a minute and kind of at least present things that are there. Sometimes, and again, it's breaking down it to little steps. Like sometimes it's like, can they just tolerate having the food on their plate? Like that could be a win, right? And maybe they don't have to eat it, right? And so some of it is putting it in their control and always having something that is part of their repertoire that they can eat, having kind of a safe food. You can have the other foods, but you kind of have to meet them where they're at. And you want to think about what's like one little step. What's one thing that they might be able to do that kind of gets them outside their comfort zone to try it? Sometimes it's just picking it up on the spoon. Maybe they don't eat it. Maybe they just touch it to their lips without going yuck, right? The kid will be like, yuck, I can't do it before they even get it near their mouth, right? So sometimes just the practice of eating without having all of that can be helpful.
Oh, that was great. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions here. Dr. Danda, thank you. That was so helpful. I really love the analogy you mentioned, a race car brain, but with bicycle brakes. That really stuck out to me. I also think it's so important, the emphasis on slowing down and implementing those change strategies. And also when we can understand how the brain works and we can really know what to do with it. And that's all lending into the emotional coaching. So that was great. I really appreciate
I didn't really
your time
mention
and
the
you spending this
along with
Friday
it,
with
but
us.
I will mention that was like, because we were talking mostly about the behavioral coaching, but the touch points I found and that's kind of comes up in my next sessions, but those are super helpful to helping. Those are all about regulating the nervous system, which is why I love them so much. And so we can talk more about those things, but that is like one tool that you can add to your toolbox that may also support some of that regulating of the nervous system. So anyway, sorry, I wanted to throw that in there too.
That's perfect. And that's exactly like what we like to say is it's another tool in your toolbox. What we would provide is not a cure or a treatment, not an alternative to medication, but another tool in your toolbox. And that will actually come about in series, in part 3 of the series. So like Alexa said, we have part 2 coming up on August 18th. We have part 3 in September. All that information will be included in that email that we send shortly hereafter. Also announcing the winner of the giveaway. So definitely make sure that you look to that email. And then also the recording on YouTube for anyone who couldn't have joined today. Alrighty, well, this has been great. Thanks again for your time. We'll go ahead and stop the recording. Dr. Danda, we'll be in touch with you here soon.